Before we get started here, I'd like to apologize to those who are looking forward to a prospect breakdown today, as our files corrupted and we lost that entire part of the podcast. Therefore, today's podcast will be a little short, but I'll lead us right into it right here, right now. Thank you for watching.
You're listening to the League Bound Podcast.
Coming again. Oh, mercy.
Your source for weekly coverage on the future stars of the NBA.
Gives it to Jenkins for the championship.
I'm your co-host, Jake Schrantz.
And I'm your co-host, Branden Blue.
With production for the podcast coming from Broderick Wilken.
With the first pick in the NBA draft.
Hello, and welcome back to the League Bound Podcast, where we break down the best draft prospects and some of the rising stars of the NBA. Today, we are on Season 2, Episode 5. I'm your co-host, Branden. I'm here with Jake and Brody. How are you guys doing today?
Branden, getting a little bit of a late start here on Episode 5, but another great episode for you all tonight. And Brody, what are you feeling about this one?
Yeah, for this one itself, it's going to be a great podcast, but just a little heads up, for Thanksgiving weekend, we are going to take a podcast break, so there will be no episode for next week's podcast. We won't have a podcast the next week after this one's release, and other than that, really got to get to it on here. We got some really interesting negativity. How about that, Branden?
Oh, yes.
Negativity!
This is an NBA, and it actually involves star player Giannis Antetokounmpo. So after they lost to the Bucks, he was trying to get some shots up after a poor shooting performance from the free throw line. Montrezl Harrell, being a little instigator, came over, stole his ball, pretty much told him to get off his court. But that's coming from Montrezl Harrell. But I'll let y'all do with that what you will. And Giannis went to go get another ball, but when he came back out, some of the workers were taking down the nets, and Giannis still wanted to get some shots up, but the workers weren't having it. So he went over, pushed down the ladder. This has been a very heated topic all over Twitter, social media, Instagram. Personally, I just find it funny. But Jake, I want to get your thoughts on this situation.
How often do we see these NBA players stay after a poor shooting night to get some extra work in, even if it's just for their, mental game, they're just feeling a little less confident. But it's kind of petty to kind of shut down someone, especially with the caliber of Giannis Antetokounmpo. You can't tell this man no. He's one of the best players, if not the best player in the league. And if he wants to get some extra work in, I don't know why they are kind of restricting him.
On a serious note, I will say I did feel bad initially because I didn't, when the whole thing came out, we didn't see all the stuff that happened with Montrez and the stuff that happened prior. And so it low-key just seemed like Giannis was just bullying a man who was doing his job. And in that respect, I kind of felt bad. But after seeing everything now, I'm just like, I still feel like Giannis shouldn't have done what he did. But at the end of the day, it's hard for me to feel bad for both parties.
And Branden, as a Sixers fan, what does the bias in you say? From a biased Sixers fan.
I should be on Harrell's side here, but it's Montrezl Harrell. He doesn't really do much for us. He comes off the bench. I don't want to be I guess I'll be a hater for once. Montrez, if you hear this, sorry, man. But it's he doesn't really do much, and even when he played with the Clippers, he just rubbed me the wrong way. It was I don't know, but it's whatever. I think Giannis, this is all gonna blow by, and we'll be talking about something else in a week. So
yeah, and Montrez is used to being part of the negativity. A couple of years ago with Luka, I remember that whole thing going on. That was really funny.
The bubble, watch. Yes, that was crazy.
The Weekly Takes.
Let's get into some of the meats of the podcast. And just this last week, we had some of the top players, DJ Wagner, who was the number one player in the class, commit to Kentucky. Isaiah Collier committed to USC, and Trey Parker, who's with Overtime Elite, actually committed to NC State next year. And NC State has a good reputation for making good guard players with Dennis Smith and Terquavion Smith, as we're seeing now. But I think what's really surprising is that I look at this list of some of the top 25 players, and even when you just look all across that top 100 board, there's not many players who are expected to join the NBA G League right now. I'm going to butcher this name, I know. I forgot to look at an interview before we got on, but Matas Buzulis from Sunrise Christian Academy is the only player right now who's expected to join.
I believe it's Buzelis, if I'm not mistaken. I feel like I've heard that last name before, so.
Yeah, right now, he's the only player expected to join the G League. And as we talked about with Mikey a few weeks ago, that's somebody who a lot of people were talking about. Bronny James, his status is kind of unknown, and people don't know what he's going to do. But as the G League got further into their career or into their process, I was expecting them to have more 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 ranked players commit, but it seems like it's just been a slow process.
Yeah, I mean, after Jalen Green and Jonathan Kuminga and some of these other guys like Scoot Henderson, you would imagine that the wave was coming for some of these later classes to follow suit and kind of lead G League Ignite into the future and kind of dominate in terms of recruiting and getting draft prospects. But you have to wonder if NIL is maybe kind of adding in a different factor that was a little bit unexpected when G League Ignite was developing as kind of just a concept, because now a lot of these schools, while they can't offer up straight contracts like G League Ignite can, they do offer, high publicity in terms of getting games on ESPN and CBS and stuff like that, but also with some NIL contracts with local businesses or even top tier like global companies like Gatorade or shoe companies like Nike and Puma, like we saw with Mikey Williams as well. So college seems to be making a comeback, but like everything in life, it is just one chapter in the story. So we'll see how the NBA and the G League kind of respond to what's been happening lately.
Yeah, and I think another thing that's worth pointing out too is that the G League just this year, this was like their first season actually doing a full like regular G League season schedule and where they can actually compete for G League championships. And you talked about getting that publicity and your name out there. I think the NCAA is just going to do that more naturally, but the G League now, one issue we've always had is it has such a small sample size, but I feel like now we have a much bigger quantity of games to go off of, and I think that could also be beneficial for not only how scouts look at a lot of the players, but just how they recruit people going forward.
I will say, though, I don't think the G League Ignite can afford to go 2 or 3 or 4 seasons straight without getting like a top first-round pick, because eventually the relevance and kind of just the name brand of it wears off. And 4 or 5 years down the line, if these players don't respect what the G League Ignite brings to them as a potential outlet other than college, then everything could come crashing down, and that would be a huge loss for the NBA.
I know we have Scoot Henderson, but I'm even looking at like the 2022 class, and there wasn't anybody who decided to go to the G League, at least that was really up there in the rankings. All of them decided to go to college. So like you pointed out, I think the G League's going to be fine in the long run, but I really think they need to focus on getting some high caliber names like Jalen Green and Jonathan Kuminga when they initially started out.
It almost seems like they're putting a lot of focus on promoting and building the current teams that they have rather than focusing on making sure they have a continual kind of new roster every year of top tier talent, which has its pros and cons, because we saw how much Scoot Henderson benefited from playing Victor Wembanyama, and that publicity really skyrocketed his potential and his draft stock. I mean, he was already projected to be the number 2 pick, but especially after everyone saw him play against Victor, he was kind of solidified at that spot. So that publicity has been beneficial, but also, like we see now with very little recruits coming in, can be a negative at times.
And looking at last year's draft classes you guys were talking about before, it doesn't go until draft pick number 8 where Dyson Daniels went to New Orleans. Yes, New Orleans.
Yes. He wasn't even projected to be the first Ignite player drafted in that one. Early in the preseason, Jaden Hardy was projected to be like a top 5 pick, and here on LeagueBound, we thought all season that he was really an elite level prospect, but overall his draft stock plummeted into I believe, the second round.
Yeah, he's not even on this list. And honestly, I was going to go make an example out of him because I remember us talking highly on him. He was pretty much the top recruit coming out of, or that committed to the G League Ignite, and he just pretty much dropped off.
Yeah.
And then after Dyson Daniels, the only other guy is Beauchamp at 24. So
yeah, Milwaukee.
I think another aspect that we kind of just glazed over here a bit, but also just how these guys do at the NBA level. Like Jalen Green, that's impressive, yeah. But like we kind of knew that was going to happen with him just because the tools that he already had coming into the league. And some of these lower name guys like Marjon Beauchamp, for example, Jaden Hardy, I think that just having a few of those guys really go into the league and kind of find their role, I think that will also really help the Ignite get more people.
It's kind of, if you compare it to like the blue bloods of college, it's kind of how Duke and Kentucky and North Carolina have remained dominant in terms of recruiting, because you can just look in the past 20 or 30 years in the draft and find so many guys that went to Duke that are elite level players. And that really adds into, prospects' minds and values when they're picking a school. So if we see some of these G League Ignite players, winning championships or winning MVPs, that could go a long way for some of these newer prospects to think that, hey, I should go to the G League Ignite. It's a great option for me.
On Tuesday night, we finally got to see some of the bigger matchups of college basketball with Michigan State and Kentucky and Duke versus Kansas. But that Duke versus Kansas game was loaded with potential prospects, and Kyle Filipowski, Grady Dick, Jalen Wilson, and Derek Lively played a little bit. Dariq Whitehead didn't play, but he did make his debut Friday. And I think that game really showed what a lot of those guys can bring at the next level. So what were some of your biggest takeaways, Jake?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of hype around Kyle Filipowski right now after these first few games just because of the combination of size and skill that he brings. He's a great passer, great shooter from the perimeter, had 17 points and 14 rebounds versus Kansas, and he was one of the biggest reasons why Duke was even in that game. It was a pretty back and forth game all the way through, but Kansas ended up getting the win in that one. But so far, Filipowski might be arguably the top draft prospect on Duke. I mean, I know you said Dariq Whitehead just made his debut, but there's been a lot of hype around Flip right now.
Yeah, I think it is warranted. In that game, he did show, what he brings. He's not really like your traditional big. Like there were moments where it seemed like he was comfortable attacking downhill, and that's a skill that, I think as a big man, that's something that just kind of separates you from others. And he's not like, it's not like he's an undersized big where you kind of see that more. Like I want to say he's about 7 foot, which is really good, and he can space the floor. So I think that Kyle Filipowski, as we go on into the season, it might be like last year where we see Duke has 2 or 3 guys in the first round, and he definitely has the potential to maybe even be a lottery pick.
And Brandon, as the resident Kansas guy on this podcast, what do you think of Grady Dick and Jalen Wilson?
Grady Dick, I think we just know when he steps onto the floor, he's going to make some great plays, and the same with Jalen Wilson. But I think the main thing that really stood out to me was just how both of them kind of stepped up late, especially Dick, because he was out. He didn't play for a good portion of the I just realized.
Keep going. No. That's his last name. It's his last name. Put some respect on it.
But he didn't play for like a good portion of the second half, but then he came in, hit a clutch layup to end the game, or not to end the game, but to kind of propel us on that run and hit some big shots. But I think I'm really more impressed with Jalen Wilson because, obviously he was on our championship team last year, and one of the big questions that we had was, can he be our leading scorer? He showed flashes his first few years, and Tuesday night he really showed that he can be that guy. And I think he could potentially have a really big breakout year, kind of like how Ochai did last year.
Yeah, and Jalen Wilson has such an interesting story in terms of just a college career. Initially was committed to Michigan when John Beilein was there. Once Beilein left to go to the NBA, he decided to transfer to Kansas, didn't play in this first year after an injury, and he really has just grinded his way into being that number one option for the Jayhawks. But like you said, I think he is definitely bound to have a huge year this year, I should say, because with no longer having Ochai Agbaji to take those game-winning shots or those shots in the clutch, I think he definitely will be their number one option on the wing to kind of, because he can score at all three levels. So there really isn't a play that Kansas could run where he shouldn't be out there as the number one option, because he's arguably the best scorer. I mean, 25 points against Duke. You're elite scoring the ball at a college level. So Jalen Wilson, huge potential. Look out for him in this upcoming draft.
The one thing I will say that kind of has been a major question and that separates him from Ochai is just his efficiency shooting from deep. And I think that's something that scouts are just going to monitor all year long. But other than that, if I remember he started out his freshman year hot. If he can just do that all season, like there's no question he could be a first rounder.
Yeah, and one of my favorite prospects in this draft, Derek Lively for Duke, didn't play too much in that one. Seemed like he had some sort of minutes restriction coming off the injury. But, I mean, he was coming off the bench for Ryan Young, which is probably going to be funny to look back on once Lively is in the league, because I think he's special. I think he has it on both ends. And it was just a short spurt of minutes versus Kansas. But I think, honestly, if he could have played more, it could have been a big-time factor in the result in this one. And maybe Duke could have gone over on the Jayhawks.
Yeah. I'm looking at it now, and it said he played about 20 minutes, but really watching the game out there, it didn't even feel like he was on the court for that long. But he had 4 points, 4 rebounds, 5 assists, and there were some moments when it seemed like, there's definitely some potential, but you could just tell that he was kind of timid. He had sat out that first week of games because of injuries, and you could tell he was just kind of trying to ease his way back into it. But this was a player who was the number one according to ESPN. And I think going forward, he really does have some great potential. But if these Blue Devils can't get healthy, then it really stunts their potential.
Yeah, but looking forward into March, if Lively and Kyle Filipowski stay healthy for the rest of the season and develop, this front court is going to be special and really hard to guard up against, because both of them are comfortable with the ball in their hands. They've got a good handle. Both can shoot from the perimeter and finish inside. So teams are going to have to figure out how to manage both of them, because Duke also has Jeremy Roach, who can get into the lane with some of the best of them in the ACC. So this Duke team has so much good NBA talent, and I'm interested to see how new coach John Shire kind of meshes it all together to try to put together a national championship in his first year.
Yeah, you just talked about it, but there's something about having young guys and just making that stride when it comes down to winning the national championship. Like, we talk about Zion, RJ, and Cam Reddish and what they had, and even they couldn't get it done. So I think if this group of mostly young prospects is able to put it together and win that championship, it's obviously going to help them, help their stock greatly. But I also think that it's just going to show that, they have a mentality that just separates them from other players. So next we're going to talk about a player who we've really talked about highly on last year's season of League Bound, but AJ Griffin yesterday had 17 points and the game winner versus the Toronto Raptors. And I've been following him kind of all season. It's really just been exciting to see him slowly get more minutes, and he's doing exactly what we talked about a year ago in these in these first few games that we've seen.
Yeah, and Atlanta has struggled at times as of late to fill in some of these young players that they draft. I mean, Onyeka Okongwu has finally started to earn some minutes for them. We've seen them kind of be forced to get rid of Kevin Huerter, who's now balling in Sacramento, just because of a crowded backcourt. And now AJ Griffin seems to be, so far early in his career, carving out a spot in their rotation and, being that effective in a game-winning situation. It's going to be huge in terms of gaining trust with your coach and honestly just getting you more minutes, because if you prove that you can be on the court in a winning situation, you're going to just gain more and more minutes, and that is really all you can ask for as a rookie.
This is why I don't like teams that, they might be contending, but they'll have preference for their veterans over young guys who, they're not only young guys, but guys who can come in and do what you need them to do. It's just, AJ, he has so much potential, and we saw that at Duke. He's got the NBA-ready body, the strength to get downhill. He's got some great shooting ability, and I feel like this is why, we need to see more younger players getting minutes.
And looking back at last year's Duke team with Paulo and AJ Griffin and some of those other guys, it's kind of surprising that they didn't win the national championship. I know they got pretty close, but look at how Paulo is just dominating the NBA, putting up basically an all-star season. Now AJ Griffin is starting to get into the mix a little bit. So, these guys are playing elite-level NBA basketball, but somehow they weren't able to put it together in college. That really has to just go for that one-and-done type of aspect in the March Madness tournament. All right, let's talk about one of my favorite players in this draft class, Terrence Shannon Jr., recently of the Texas Tech Red Raiders, now part of the University of Illinois. He's currently averaging 14 more points per game than he did last year for Texas Tech. And before he played Virginia tonight, TSJ had back-to-back huge games offensively, 30 points versus Monmouth, and then 29 points in a win over number 8 UCLA. 8 of 9 3-point shooting is just incredible. That was really impressive from him. But tonight he had just 9 points versus Virginia. So hopefully this doesn't mean we're in for kind of a return to norm for TSJ yet. But Branden, he is in his 4th season of college. Do you think with him being a 22-year-old prospect, is that going to impact his draft stock at all?
It may, just because I don't think it'll necessarily hurt him, though, as much as it'll just, this is kind of contradictory, but help the people around him, if that makes sense. Because, we see scouts these days, like just look at Gigi Jackson, for instance. They have preference for the guys who are younger. And I think sometimes they even kind of ignore, what you already see and just go a little bit too much off the upside. But for Shannon, I think that, he's definitely a great prospect. He's got good size, can shoot the ball, and watching him at Texas Tech last year, he was really an exciting player to watch. I know we talked about him a few times for our stock up segments last year, so he's really just an interesting player to watch, and I think his stock is something that we'll be monitoring all season.
Yeah, and he has such a deep bag in terms of offensive skills. He can rise up and dunk, arguably the best in the country. He has a great shot from 3-point range. He was 8 for 9 recently versus a great UCLA team. But looking back at last year's draft, the first senior that we saw go off the board was actually to Cleveland with Ochai Agbaji, who I would honestly, it's kind of hard to compare Ochai and Terrence Shannon, but in terms of just being a senior, being that veteran player in college basketball and having your best season, that's basically what Terrence Shannon is having this year. So we'll see if history repeats itself, because both Ochai and Terrence Shannon are putting up huge numbers, but Ochai barely made it into the lottery and is barely making it on the court for the Utah Jazz. So hopefully Terrence Shannon doesn't get demoted or kind of put down on the boards just because of his history.
This is very slight, but I think one thing that Terrence Shannon does have, one advantage he does have that Ochai doesn't, is he transferred from Texas Tech to Illinois, so he's having to kind of play in a different system a little bit. And I know the jump from college to NBA can be kind of hard to monitor, but in a sense, I think this can kind of be a good metaphor just in case, or just in the sense of you're having to learn new philosophies, a new game plan, a new game style. The coach has, probably different ways he wants to play defense, different ways he wants to score the ball. And I think Shannon just still being able to thrive in this new system, I think can be something that scouts will kind of mark positively.
I also want to bring up the fact that, at least from what I believe, a big reason Ochai went as far as he did, he shined as bright as they come in March Madness, just really proving his worth against top-tier competition in college basketball. So do you guys think that Illinois would have to make a deep run for him to kind of get the draft stock respect as Ochai if he continues putting up the numbers he is right now?
I would say so, just because Ochai kind of over his career proved to be a little bit better of a two-way player. Terrence Shannon right now is much more of a offensive-minded player. He has the size and athleticism to be an elite defensive player, but so far his main kind of positive aspects of him as a prospect are his scoring ability, athleticism, and stuff like that. But if Illinois, who is a really good team this year, if they can go out and maybe put together a Final Four appearance or maybe a national championship even, and Terrence Shannon is the reason for that, if he's like that number one guy that pops off the screen and it's like, wow, this guy is the reason, I definitely think he could get up into the lottery, no problem.
I think, too, another thing is like just consistency, because I know during his time at Tech, it was like, it wasn't always like he was having a stellar performance every game, or his shooting numbers weren't always that great. But I think if he does what we talked about, like Illinois goes deep, and if he shows that he can be more of a consistent player, not only shooting wise, but just mentality, mindset, then I think that will also help his stock.
Yeah, that is the thing. I mean, 9 points in just under 40 minutes of play versus Virginia, that coming off of 2 back-to-back almost 30-point games, that goes to show you that inconsistency that TSJ has struggled with so far in his career. But we'll see as the competition kind of improves throughout the season, especially in the Big Ten, where there's a lot of focus on just grit and grind and hard physical defense. We'll see how Shannon manages that aspect of a defense. I'm excited for it.
Yeah, man. Another player that I'm excited to talk about is Brandon Miller from Alabama. He's a player I actually wanted to talk about on last week's pod, but I decided not to. But now I'm finally getting to it. Early in the season, there were many reports that this guy looked like he could be a real deal player. And through his first 4 games, though it hasn't been against some serious competition, he's been putting up some good numbers. He's averaging 20 points per game on 50% shooting from the field goal and 50% shooting from the three-point line. And this is a 6'9" kid with really good size, and I think him being this good of a shooter is just deadly and will make him a dangerous player at the next level. But I'm excited to see this guy play in the PK80 next week. They play Michigan State, and I'm really excited to see how he does against some more high-level and probably ranked competition.
Yeah, and Michigan State's going to be a big challenge for Brandon Miller because they're having a great season so far with wins over Kentucky and Villanova just a couple of nights ago. But Brandon Miller, I mean, he just has that typical GM, almost like dream type of prospect. Super long, 6'9", but he's efficient from the three-point line. 50% through 4 games is nothing to kind of throw away. But Brandon, do you have any sort of early comparisons for people who haven't got to see Brandon Miller yet? Because it is just through 4 games.
You know, part of me, it's hard because it's like, part of me sees a little bit of like KD in him, but I don't think that's crazy because now people are going to say like, oh my God, he's saying he's KD. But like, I think just the way that, you know, he has the size he has, the long arms, the wingspan. I don't really think he's nearly as good of a creator as KD is, but just kind of watching him play, that's kind of what I get in my mind. Like, I think KD, if he were more of a spot-up guy. But this guy, he's shown that, you know, he can, you know, whip out some moves at some time, or, you know, he can hit a fadeaway if need be. I think what's really going to happen for him is if we see him create more shots for himself and just kind of get to wherever he wants, then I think that he might potentially even be a top 10 pick.
Thank you for listening and watching the League Bound podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, feel free to like and subscribe, and you can find us on Spotify and YouTube under League Bound.